Hello everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host Ricardo Lopes and today I'm joined by Dr. Filipe Nobre Faria. He currently works as a postdoctoral researcher in ethics and political philosophy at the Institute for Philosophy of the Nova University of Lisbon. He lectures on subjects of his expertise at the Faculty of Social and Human Sciences. Previously, he earned his PhD in political theory from King's College London and his master's degree in philosophy, politics and economics from the University of East Anglia. He also taught within the areas of political theory, political economy at King's College London. His main research interest lies in applying the insights of the behavioral and evolutionary sciences to issues in social and political philosophy. So, Dr. Nobre Faria, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a huge pleasure to be here, and a big responsibility, especially knowing that I come after names such as David Sloan Wilson, Michael Ruse, among many other big names. So it is a great pleasure and a deep responsibility to be here, but so I hope that that I don't disappoint.
Oh, it's going to go well. You don't have to worry about that. Okay, so let's see. This is very interesting because when people think about philosophy and the humanities in general even, they don't tend to associate it, at least immediately, with things coming more from biology and other areas like that, and in this particular case, evolutionary theory. So, in your case, how do you establish a bridge between evolutionary theory and philosophy and other specific areas that you deal with in your work, like politics and ethics?
Right. Yeah, that's a very big question. Yeah. So when I describe my work, I usually say that I work with. So I apply evolutionary reasoning to problems in political philosophy and ethics. So we now know that evolutionary ethics is a relatively big field now, and it has grown a lot in the last decades. On the other hand, evolutionary politics is not so big, so it remains somehow marginal. And of course, we know that there are several reasons for this. We know that, for instance, since the end of Second World War, there is this aversion to evolutionary politics. So ideas like natural selection of traits and heredity are seen as controversial and as something we should not apply to political analysis. And there's also a deep suspicion that evolutionary thinking at the moral level is not actually compatible with our current liberal paradigm. That if we do analyze these questions from an evolutionary perspective, we might question our average assumptions of how politics should operate, how ethics works, etc., etc. So. But to go deeper into your question, so what does evolutionary theory bring to the table? So at the level of politics and ethics, well, it helps to answer questions such as why are we cooperative, why are we tribal, why do we fight, why are we egoistic, and why are we altruistic? So, and because politics is an expression of human tendencies, we can better understand politics if we understand these tendencies. It's not that we will always use this knowledge in the right way, obviously, but I think that normative decisions that are robust at the epistemic level are more likely to be helpful. And this is why I do think that it's very important to understand evolutionary theory and evolutionary findings when we are discussing questions of politics and ethics.
Mm-hmm. Yes, at a certain point there you refer to the fact that probably there are some psychological and sociological barriers for people to accept evolutionary theory applied to more broadly the human mind, right? But on the other hand, wouldn't you also say that perhaps that particular endeavor of applying evolutionary theory to explaining human behavior and human psychology, it is also, from an historical perspective at least, a very recent one? Because as far as I remember, we've only been doing it more or less starting in the 70s or somewhere around that, with first sociobiology, and then in the late 80s, early 90s, with the introduction of evolutionary psychology. So isn't that perhaps another reason that that kind of approach is a very recent one, intellectually and academically speaking?
Sure. So there are several reasons. I guess we would have to write a paper on this in order to to come up with all the reasons. Sure, that is also an important point. Nonetheless, before the Second World War, evolutionary reasoning was quite common, even in the social sciences, even in philosophy, ethics, etc. Of course, not everyone was an evolutionist at the time. Many people were critical of approaches from authors such as Herbert Spencer and others. But it was quite common before the Second World War to approach these questions in terms of evolution. Now, of course, we from our perspective, we can say that in some ways they were wrong, and they were or they were simply coming to conclusions that were not strictly evolutionary. And that is a good point, and there is certainly a case to be made. But I do think that if I had to choose one particular point, it would be I would point towards the changing in morality that took place after the Second World War. And I think we will still discuss this further on, but I think that influenced decisively the way we conducted research, the way we would present findings, and in a way it even influences what we can think. So am I willing to go there, so to speak? So there are these difficult questions. Do we really want to go there? And sometimes we don't want to, because the costs are too high at many levels. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you've already alluded to some of the ways by which evolutionary theory, when introduced to the study of human behavior, really brought some changes in terms of the way we do philosophy, particularly when thinking about things that where human behavior plays a role, like, for example, politics and ethics and morality and things like that. And I think that that is a very interesting point to explore here, because until very recently, from an historical perspective, isn't it true that, for example, when people were thinking about human cognition or epistemology, how we know the world, what we are able to know about it, and perhaps innate structures of the mind that impose limitations as to how we can acquire knowledge about the world and things like that. I mean, for the last 2000 years or so, people have been speculating a lot about how those things worked, but nowadays, particularly with cognitive science and behavioral science, we are able to give an answer to those very old questions in a scientifically minded way. Right.
So yes, so we are now at a much better point with respect to analyzing these questions from a scientific perspective. We have a lot of data, much more data than we had in the past. I'm not completely sure about this, but it seems to me that now we have systems of science that allow for more academics to work on these questions, which also allows for more data, more insights, and so hopefully this also means that we know more about what about the structure of reality, so to speak. So when it comes to analyzing politics, ethics, the question is: should we always start from here, or should we just speculate a little bit beforehand and then eventually look at the structure of reality? So I do think that it is important to start by understanding central questions that influence politics, such as the nature of morality. So, for example, perhaps the first question would be: what is the evolutionary function of morality in the social and political realm? Which, of course, the answer would certainly be that morality's function is to help our genes survive in time. So it is somehow an answer that will not please many people, because it seems to be extremely reductionist and deterministic. And if we take this a Kantian perspective on morality, we may feel that this is completely destructive of our ability to reason about morality, to actually change questions that depend on social norms and depend on our understanding of morality. But I guess that if we do accept this premise, then we still have a long way to go. But at least we will be on what I think is a stabler basis. So we are departing from a position that allows us to reach more robust conclusions. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so nowadays even philosophers, I mean, if they are to do a rigorous work, they always have to start from what we already know coming from science about human behavior, even when thinking about morality and ethics, because if they are simply to do as people always did, like speculating about how people tend to behave and how people behave in natural environments, or how we are to change people's behavior and things like that, I mean, they would be at a really bad position nowadays, because that would probably be something like we call, when we refer to people that sit in a place and simply come up with ideas and accept the ideas that perhaps sound better to them, like when we use the expression armchair philosophy, right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Yes, and I do think that is already happening. The reason why evolutionary ethics as a field is steadily growing, I think, is because it becomes very difficult to ignore everything that is coming from the behavioral sciences, the genetic science in general, and anthropology. So, of course, there's always some margin to speculate, but I think that people are less likely these days to completely ignore this basis, especially in philosophy. We can talk about other fields that perhaps are still very interested in ignoring this basis. So. Of course, we can talk about postmodern studies and other fields that seem to have a denial of objective truth and of an objective reality. But I do think that now it becomes much more complicated to ignore what is happening, and philosophy is becoming more biologized. And I do think that the same thing will happen to politics and in other fields. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's talk now more specifically about morality, because I guess that by talking with other people, particularly people who apply evolutionary theory to fields like politics, for example, it seems that morality is really the basis for those more developed behaviors, perhaps like we have nowadays in our complex political systems and things like that. But regarding morality, would you say that perhaps the fundamental question here is to start off by understanding if, or by knowing if, people are mostly selfish or mostly altruistic?
Right. So that is a standard debate. So, well, first of all, we must understand how we operate with morality in these fields. For example, as we know from cultural evolution studies, a morality that does not promote genetic perpetuation is one that is likely to be selected out of the evolutionary system. And this gives us a standard that allows us to evaluate and understand moral and political phenomena. Of course, what we do with this information is quite complex or controversial, especially at the normative level, as we know. So I tend to prefer a functionalist approach in the tradition of Aristotle. So in order to understand if something is good, then we have to ask, what is its function? So we may ask, for example, what is a good heart? And the answer would be something like, a good heart is efficient at pumping blood, while a bad heart is not, right? So that could be an answer. So we could, in social terms, we could also ask, what is the function of a father? What is the function of a mother? What is the function of a politician? So although not a panacea, this can help us to answer questions of good and bad, questions of normativity. So it is here that it becomes important to understand if humans are mostly selfish or mostly altruistic. And sure, so yes, the evolution of altruism has been a central debate in evolutionary theory, as we know. So we can already find it in Darwin's writings. So it is important to understand how and why altruism evolves and how egoism evolves. Because politics and morality are very much about the tension between acting for the good of others and acting for our own good. So I think it is clear that Darwin thought that altruism evolves via group selection. And in this sense, altruism evolves for the good of the group, or the tribe, in competition with other groups. So these days, group selection has a more sophisticated version called multi-level selection, which is associated with David Sloan Wilson, Elliot Sober. You had David Sloan Wilson recently in your show. And the multi-level selection, in a nutshell, asserts that selection takes place at several levels. So at the level of the individual, at the level of the gene, at the level of the group, and essentially that egoism is beneficial within groups, but when groups are in competition, then altruism is beneficial, and therefore more altruistic groups beat less altruistic groups. But for instance, inclusive fitness, which is much more used, for example, in evolutionary psychology, is also a model that can be seen as complementary to multi-level selection. They are not necessarily antagonistic. This is something already, these days it is known as equivalence. So you can account for gene frequencies by using these different models. And so, of course, all these questions have dissidents, but I would say that most evolutionary thinkers think that groups are central to evolution. So groups are central to evolution, whether at the cultural or at the biological level. Yeah, yeah.
Yes, and I guess that there's still some tension between when we think about, for example, inclusive fitness and then group selection, because I guess that there are researchers who say that, for example, reciprocal altruism, that is a phenomenon that stems from inclusive fitness, in the sense that, and also kin selection, of course, because we start with people evaluating others in terms of genetic relatedness, and the ones that are more genetically related to them, they tend to be more altruistic towards them, right? And that's, in a nutshell, what kin selection is about. And then reciprocal altruism is more about establishing relations of reciprocity between us and other people that don't really have to be genetically related to us in that sense. Mm-hmm. But there are people who say that, and I will include here, for example, Robert Rivers, who say that reciprocal altruism solves the issue of why we evolved the entirety of our repertoire of altruistic behaviors that we manifest. But then, as you pointed to, Dr. David Sloan Wilson, and recently also E.O. Wilson and others, say that reciprocal altruism is not enough to explain all of our altruistic behaviors, because there are some that seem really weird to explain, like, for example, when someone sacrifices herself to save someone that is in danger, that is not part of her family or isn't even a friend of hers, for example. And that's when people say that we would need group selection to explain that. So I would like to ask you, regarding that debate, what is your position?
Yes, I tend to favor group selection, or as it is known today, multi-level selection. I do think that selection operates at several levels, and as you said, I think that reciprocal altruism has some problems to a certain extent. For example, if you self-sacrifice to a certain to the extent that you know that you're going to die, or you may risk your life, well, there will be no chance for the other person to pay you back if you die by doing that, right? So I was never completely convinced by the logic of reciprocal altruism, where people just play this tit for tat game. So I do think that we need groups. That groups are fundamental entities in evolution, and it makes sense because individuals are evolutionarily weak, right? Ricardo and me, we as individuals, we are not very robust. We can get sick very easily, or we can be run over by a car just by crossing the streets. So in evolutionary terms, we are not very robust as individuals, but we are much more robust as groups. So it's much more difficult to make a group go extinct. It's not impossible, obviously, but I think that groups are a fundamental part of how evolution operates. Which doesn't mean, of course, that these groups don't have certain constitutions that operate on the basis of genetic relatedness, which I think makes perfect sense, right? it makes perfect sense that if we're talking about heredity, then genetic relatedness is a strong factor. So I tend to use multi-level selection in my work, but I'm perfectly fine with inclusive fitness, and I do think that for certain questions, sometimes it is useful to simply use Hamilton's inclusive fitness for kin selection. That's perfectly fine. But I do think that overall, if we want to analyze societies at more macro levels, we really have to look at groups. I think it's fundamental. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and when people ask if humans are mostly selfish or mostly altruistic, does that question really make sense? Because I mean, I guess that I was just thinking here for myself, but I guess that, for example, when Richard Dawkins back in the 70s wrote The Selfish Gene, I mean, that's not something to take literally. It was basically a metaphor that genes are selfish because they want to get passed to the next generation or something like that. But I mean, genes by themselves, they don't have a psychology. So it's simply a metaphor. But what's interesting with that, and even with that book specifically, is that he also explains how from selfish entities that are the units of selection here, namely genes, we can develop altruistic behavior because those same genes might also be part of other organisms with whom we are related, right?
Right. Yes, it is a question that puzzles many people outside of the evolutionary world. Do we really have altruistic behavior, or if we dig deep down, isn't it really just a matter of pursuing our what we may call genetic interests, so to speak? And I guess it depends on how we define altruism and egoism. Of course, it is possible to argue that in the end, all altruistic behavior is about egoism, because altruistic behavior exists only insofar as it serves the interests of genetic propagation. So because we are coded to propagate our genes to a certain extent, this sometimes has some nuance. But this may and of course this may very well be true. But for the purpose of social analysis, it is important to separate self-sacrificing behavior that aims at helping others to separate this from behavior that is merely self-serving. And this separation is crucial to understand evolutionary strategies at the cultural, moral, or even at political levels. So what I mean by this is, of course, if we analyze this question purely at the meta level, we may come to the conclusion that there's no such thing as altruism. But that answer does not really serve us as social analysts. So we need to understand how that egoism, so to speak, is expressed in social terms. And so we have to find terms for self-sacrificing behavior, more egoistic in this narrow sense behavior, etc., etc. So, for example, with politics, a corrupt politician can focus on his family only, on his class only, or even on himself, and this may hurt the nation as a whole, right? And that's why usually what we call corruption is cooperation at smaller scales. Simply, there's a small group that is essentially trying to get benefits for itself, not considering the benefits of the general society. And usually we call this corruption, but it's actually a form of cooperation. So but public goods games show that most people are conditional cooperators. So they are altruistic as long as others are also altruistic. So they cooperate if others are cooperating. And this seems to show that pure free riders are not the norm, and that it was not adaptive to be a free rider, even though inside groups, free riders beat altruists. But when there is competition between groups, altruism evolves by giving advantages to more altruistic groups. We can say then that it's quite unlikely that a politician is purely selfish in that sense, that it doesn't even cooperate or is altruistic towards the members that are the group that is with them. Let's say an elite or a party, or he has to cooperate with somebody in order to be in that position. So he cannot be a pure free rider, so to speak. And of course, it's commonplace to say that politics is something tribal, and we are now in a better position to understand why.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I mean, I guess that there's two questions here. On the one hand, at the end of the day, if you want, you can always say that people are simply selfish, because I guess people could say, oh yes, they do good deeds, but it's just because they are expecting that later people will reciprocate, or they only treat others in a good way because they don't want to get punished by them or something like that. But on the other hand, I mean, if we're trying here to get people to behave as best as they can, if we are to create, for example, environments that tweak their internal morality or innate morality toward good behavior, I mean, does that really matter? Does it really matter if people are doing it for selfish reasons?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so morality always requires some form of punishment in order to help groups to actually operate on the basis of that morality, right? Usually morality has notions of things that you should do and things that you shouldn't do. And this creates sort of a guideline for punishment. So institutions are based on this notion that it will allow and even promote behavior that is considered moral, and it will punish everyone that engages in immoral behavior, which means it goes against that type of morality. And we see this in political institutions. So we know that if we are living within a certain paradigm with a certain morality, then everyone outside that paradigm will be marginalized to a certain degree, right? We know that even our notions of left and right, we tend to see it as to be in the center. So to be the moderate person is to be the person that is perfectly in line with the paradigm, right? So let's say I am the perfect liberal Democrat, and therefore I'm in the center. And then you start deviate. The more you deviate to the left and you go to the extremes, and you become less part of the paradigm, you become more extreme. By extreme, it actually means more immoral. You're deviating from the standard. And so there are punishment mechanisms for that, so to prevent that these extremes enter our moral and political institutions. Yeah. So what I would say is that yes, punishment is extremely important. And I read somewhere, I don't remember exactly where, somebody tried to explain why free riders still exist, and the explanation was something like, well, free riders also learn to hide their true instincts, and so they're able to just go. They understand that if they show it too much, that they will be punished, and therefore they learn how to move within the moral sphere without being punished. So, but I guess that this is only possible to a certain degree, because it's not possible to hide it all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, and in regards to moral psychology, what are some of the other aspects that we have to consider with the knowledge that we have nowadays? And I'm referring to, for example, the work done by Jonathan Haidt and the fact that he found there that we have moral foundations that are innate, like care, harm, fairness, respect for authority, loyalty to the group, and purity / sanctity and things like that. So is it also important when dealing with ethical and moral questions to consider the fact that we have some structures of our mind that are associated with our moral behavior that are innate and that predispose us to behave in certain ways when faced with certain social issues or social problems, and that the strategies that we develop might also have something to do with our personality and personal interests?
Mm-hmm. 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 Yes. So if I understand your question correctly, are we influenced by our innate predispositions when it comes to adhering to certain political visions, to certain political ideology? Yes, I think that we have good evidence that that is the case. It's our let's call it innate tendencies will help to engage in particular ideology. We'll think that this ideology appeals more to us, or that ideology appeals more to us. But I think that there's also a contextual question here. If we understand morality as an expression of genetic propagation, we can also expect that people will also be influenced by their position in society. For example, if we are in a position in society that is more fragile, that is somehow that doesn't give us many opportunities to flourish or to achieve power or to have some influence in society. Even perhaps we even have tendencies to be more conservative, so to speak. But that context itself may make us engage in what perhaps Nietzsche would call slave morality, which is a cry for equality. And because of the context itself, it doesn't make sense in a given context to simply remain with a stable ideology. So I think ideology will also, it depends on our predisposition, but it also depends on on the context of society, especially where we are at the moment in society. That will be also a very important factor that helps to define if we're gonna go socialist or conservative or anything you may think. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now this is perhaps a strictly philosophical question. In regards to politics and society, what should we deem to be more important? To have a stable society or to follow what we consider to be good? That is, for example, let's say that, let me just give you an example. Let's say that we were to find out that multicultural societies are less stable. Should we prefer to have a more stable society or to try to treat all people from different cultures and minorities and so on in a humane way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so now we enter into the normative realm, and this is where things usually get hot. uh, yes, of course, we will, of course, stability is a good, and we will appreciate stability, especially if we lose it, right? So it's usually how it works. So yeah, stability is a common good. I think we appreciate. On the other hand, stability comes with costs, and some of those costs are of a moral nature. We understand it every single day by checking the news, understanding how politics develops. That often many politicians talk about we need security. They use the security card in order to achieve certain states of the world that I think that, and they are pressing on the question of stability. And sometimes by doing that, they start engaging in this separation between us versus them, and so I'm not completely sure if this is avoidable. Of course, we may try to control it to a certain degree, but I'm not completely convinced that actually I'm not convinced at all that it is something that we can erase simply with ideology or with public policy. But of course, we can try to be reasonable in these questions, and sometimes to be reasonable is difficult, especially because it's easier to be reasonable when there is stability. When there is no stability, usually reasonableness goes out of the window. So it is perhaps important that we don't reach that stage where society is really without much stability.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's say that we have decided on a set of behaviors that we consider to be good, but then through science we discover that, for example, people are not really innately predisposed to favor those sorts of behaviors, at least when dealing with, for example, people that are part of other groups, or have group identities that they don't share with them, for example. Should we make some concessions there and perhaps negotiate what we consider to be good and bad? Or should we keep our ideals because in the long run they perhaps could pay off?
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's a very good question. I think there is evidence showing that if there is one thing that people don't negotiate very well is moral values. People can negotiate better when it comes to money, when it comes to material conditions. When it comes to morality, people are not very good at negotiating. So this is why Jonathan Haidt came up with the expression "morality binds and blinds." Right? People are joined in a group with a given morality, and they are not willing to give that one up. And we can present arguments, we can present evidence. It's still very difficult to make people negotiate their values. Of course, what can we say about this? Perhaps liberalism and liberal pluralism already focuses on this negotiation of values, but even liberal pluralism itself doesn't it doesn't give up liberal pluralism. So there is something there that is also sacred, and that will not be respected by everyone. You need to understand the liberal language and to somehow feel sympathetic towards it in order to engage in a discussion. But if you're completely in another paradigm, even that type of negotiation may become very, very complicated. So it's easier to negotiate material goods. Values, much more complicated.